seeing a lot of people outright Steve Erceg just because of his ranking, when I think this fight is a lot closer than what people are thinking. Now, let's be real. Alexander Pantoja is only taking this fight because he's fought everyone else in the division. He has beaten everyone else in the division. Steve Erceg is the one person he hasn't faced yet, who is showing some true colors and who is showing some true signs of a future champion. Let's start it off with his first fight in the UFC, where he took it on 10 days notice and fought David Dvorak to a decision win by him. And if you look at that fight, he starts it off very crispy. His feints mean everything. In these next 3 fights that I'm going to talk about, which is his only 3 fights in the UFC, I want you to keep an eye on his feints, because his feints lead everything into his striking. Whether it's his probing jab, or whether it's his step feints, or whether it's any sort of kick feint that he throws, all feints have meanings. And one thing I do like to point out is he loves his 1-2-3s. What do I mean by that? He loves his jab, he loves his cross, and he loves his lead hook. Those are the main punches he always throws. Whether the next punch that he is next accustomed to is either the high kick that I've been seeing, or it is the rear hook after the lead hook. So we are seeing a very, I guess, simple, polished, I'd like to say, striker in Steve Erceg. Now that 2 is very dynamic. That 2 can go from a looping 2 to then a straight 2 to then almost like a shovel 2 to like an uppercut type of thing. And Steve Erceg loves throwing a 3 right before he throws that 2. We've also seen glimpses of his takedowns and his overall grappling, as in the David Dvorak fight, he was able to scramble. He was able to get the guillotine after hurting David Dvorak. And also, he was able to just scramble altogether to get out of positions, to get out of certain situations, or to even get his position better than David Dvorak, who is a very good fighter. David Dvorak is not someone you can take lightly, especially on 10 days notice. He's also extremely smart in taking rounds. Now, what do I mean by that? We see it a lot with, honestly, Australian, New Zealand fighters, where in the last minute, the last 30 seconds, they will do something to make these judges look like this guy won the round, especially in a very close round. It's very smart. It's very well technical, where you can get the takedown or you can get a big punch and then kind of cruise. And that's the last memory these judges have going into who won this round. These judges are very incompetent. I think we've all noticed that. The fact that we know judges' names and how shitty their work has been says a lot. I mean, everyone knows Derek Clearly, Sal D'Amato, everyone knows Shugorio Kamijo. Everyone knows their names. I mean, it's horrendous to even think about that. And what does Steve Erceg do to be able to, I guess, capitalize on the idiocracy of judging? They steal rounds. They last 30 seconds, last minute, they make it appear that they won the round, which gets them that round nod. Because I thought in that 3rd round against David Dvorak, it was a lot closer than what it seemed. I thought David Dvorak was just a tiny bit ahead, and then Steve Erceg gets a takedown. Maybe he doesn't really lay on top of him. It was a very big exchange that got into that takedown, and then they were able to kind of cruise to the end of the fight. But that's the last look. That's the last look that you see at the end of the fight, which I think gave Steve Erceg that fight. I will mention one of his cons, being that he does like to brawl a little bit, and he does like to be in the fire when he really shouldn't be. Steve Erceg is one of the more polished fighters I've seen in the flyweight division, other than maybe Kai Kara-France in terms of striking, where you're in that outside boxing range, you look very well. Kai Kara-France is a tiny bit different. It is more inside boxing. With Steve Erceg, it is to that outside boxing where his jab and cross land very beautifully, where it is polished, it is looking beautiful. If it looks beautiful, it is Steve Erceg's fight, and we've seen that. And my biggest issue is that he will get a little, I guess, anxious, or he will get maybe bored. That's my guess, where all of a sudden he's winning this fight and then he just kind of overthrows or tries to brawl it out. And we saw that he overthrew against David Dvorak, where he ended up getting taken down for what it was, maybe 10 seconds, because Steve Erceg is that good of a scrambler that he was able to get out of it. But the fact that you got that takedown, you got someone to your hips because you overthrew, is a very big scare in my opinion. Because with a guy like Alexander Pantoja, if he gets your hips, if he gets anywhere near you in terms of clinching, guess what? That's the round. I mean, let's be real, that is the round. You're never gonna see Alexander Pantoja really get off of you. Alexander Pantoja is just a mauler. He just is constantly in your face. He's constantly there. And if this fight is on the ground, I don't think Steve Erceg can really do much. Now, that's not to say that Steve Erceg is not very polished in his wrestling. No, he has great wrestling. We see that in the overall submissions and the scrambles that he does get in these 3 UFC fights. However, we are seeing that people can take him down. And with a guy like Alexander Pantoja, who is just always going to get a takedown. I mean, that I feel like every Alexander Pantoja fight, he at least gets 1 or 2, or he at least gets a submission. We are seeing that, and that's just not a good look. If David Dvorak can get to your hips, Alexander Pantoja can definitely get to it. We move on to his second fight, Steve Erceg versus Alexandre Costa. I believe that's how you say that name. And one thing I do like to say is he likes to lure people in with his counterpunching. When he is given pressure, when he is given the opportunity to, he likes to be a counterpuncher. I'm starting to notice that a lot more when someone is pressuring him. We saw that in the Mashnell fight that I will get to, and we saw it in the Costa fight where if he is getting pressured, he does not mind being on the back foot and being the counter puncher. And he likes luring people in to that lead hook, that 3 that I was talking about earlier. He likes to either do the 3 or the 2. He likes to do a step back 2, kind of like what O'Malley does. A lot less pop and a lot less flair, but it is a very straight and accurate punch. He's very smart with his jab, and it is not a step jab. It is not a very powerful jab, but it is just a pop. It is just there, and it's gonna constantly bother you. The only way I can put this is kind of what Sean Strickland has. Obviously their fight, both of them fight completely different, but the jab is sort of the same, where there is no real telegraph, and it's not the most powerful punch in the world, but it's just eating you. And if you eat 8, if you eat 10, 11, 12, your eye is going to swell up, your nose is going to start getting busted, you're going to start getting cut, and you're playing into both of their fights. And we see that with the Erceg fight against Costa, where part of that fight was just the jab. The jab was just eating him alive, and it wasn't really getting anywhere for Costa. Once again, we see a very high feint game in terms of how to read an opponent, how to get an opponent biting for something. All feints have meanings for Steve Erceg, and we see that in these 3 fights, the only 3 fights that he does have in the UFC, where every feint means something. Every feint is going to try to get set up with something else. And I think with that type of striking game and how polished his 1, 2, 3, his rear hook and his high kick, we see that the feints are just going to mean a lot more than what people think. I would also like to say about the overall adaptation of Steve Erceg's game, because we saw in the David Dvorak fight that the leg kicks were just eating him alive, and in this Costa fight he does very well in checking kicks. And so there is a big tell of Steve Erceg keeps getting better, and who knows how good he's feeling going into this Alexander Pantoja fight, because he just fought a ranked guy in Mashnell. It is his second ranked fight in the UFC, where Steve Erceg looked great. Let's be real, Steve Erceg has been looking great, and if it wasn't for Alexander Pantoja destroying this division, basically, he would have had another fight in the flyweight rankings where Steve Erceg could look better. I do want to talk about the knockdown that he did have in the first, where the feints had meanings, and the feint was the 2. He feinted and then threw that 2, which landed perfectly on Costa, which then got him to shoot. And then we saw the scrambling ability of Steve Erceg once again, where he just gets top mount so effortlessly. And I would like to talk about the Steve Erceg composure. This guy, I just look at him. He doesn't look like the most intimidating guy. He doesn't look like a guy that if you caught him around the street, you're like, oh, this guy's a fighter. No, you don't see that out of Astro Boy. We see a guy who is composed. We see a guy who is calm, and that is in the ring, that is out of the octagon and in the octagon, where he is composed no matter what. And we see that in that knockdown where he was able to relax himself, even though he did get a guy just hurt, and just get top mount. He got top mount and was able to just ride him until until he was able to get either a submission or what actually happened. Costa ended up getting up. That is more on the part of Steve Erceg's actual wrestling top game. It's not the greatest in the world. It's not bad. It is very doable. It is very manageable. It can win him a fight. It's not his go-to, but it can win him a fight. Now, in this Costa fight, we do see a lot of the cons of Steve Erceg, where he doesn't really react too well with explosiveness. Costa was able to land when he was able to land in this fight based off of just pure explosion, based off of just catching Steve Erceg off guard. And I think that is the main issue when it comes to this Alexander Pantoja fight, where Alexander Pantoja does not give a fuck who you are. He is going to walk you down and he's going to brawl it out with you. And I'm very scared that Erceg will accept the brawl, that Erceg will be like, okay, we'll go and brawl. That's when Pantoja can get his takedowns. That's when Pantoja can hurt you. If the fight looks ugly, Pantoja is winning this. That also leads me to another point. Although we have only seen like 3 fights, he is very chinny. Like, he does get hurt. He does get a little wobbly sometimes, and it's based off of that inside boxing. I think that is my main flaw with Steve Erceg, where he accepts the inside boxing. You can't do that. Fighters need to understand what they're really good at and only rely on that. Don't try to make it any different. Who cares that you can outside box, but then someone's like, oh, you can't inside box? You want to prove them wrong? Guess what? It's going to make the fight harder. If Steve Erceg can keep this on the outside, Steve Erceg is going to look like $1,000,000. If he brawls with Pantoja, a guy that is known for brawling, known for that sort of shoot, catch, shoot, fight, catch, shoot, fight, brawl, it's game over. This fight is not going to be competitive. Steve Erceg needs to make this fight look pretty. One thing I also like to point out that happened in the Costa fight, where Steve Erceg, when he was taken down, when he was on his back, first of all, he wasn't too eager to stand up. He didn't really look like he just needed to stand up, and that's not really the biggest flaw. My big flaw is he is a wrestler. He is a national gold medalist for his country, where he will get to his back instantly. That's his initial thought, and every wrestler has that thought. Every wrestler who's wrestled for an actual folk style wrestling will just get to their back immediately, because that stops them from getting pinned. In this case, you get on your back against Pantoja, it's game over. Pantoja's gonna ride your back out for oh my god. Pantoja is going to get on your back and try to submit you, and if not, he's going to hold you on for the rest of the round. Steve Erceg does like to land very sneaky clinch knees, and I say sneaky based off the fact that he just kind of does it out of whenever he wants to. There is no real push. It's kind of like how his jab is, where it's not really trying to hurt you, it's just trying to connect. It's just trying to get there, and that's what his knees do. This is not really a flaw, because it's more of an assumption. Steve Erceg did look a little bit weak when he is in that clinch, when he is in that wrestling, and Costa was able to outmuscle him. Now, Costa is a freak of a man. He is 125 somehow, and he is roided out. He is so muscly, but Steve Erceg does look like he has some sort of weakness in terms of his actual muscle strength. Now let's go to the fight that everyone remembers, the Match Snell Steve Erceg fight, where he became a very, very calculated counterpuncher and was able to counterpunch to a pressure fighting, very fluid. His changing of the guard kept going and kept changing. It didn't stop. And I think that is very prominent of what Steve Erceg is, which is a very polished striker. This guy is one of the most polished flyweights I've seen in a while. Steve Erceg is a very pretty, very beautiful boxing style that I don't think anyone can really hate. He does, like in his last 3 fights, when he is in that close boxing range, he does like to duck. He does like to get in the fire and then duck and then kind of throw his hooks out from that close range. And we saw that almost in the knockout, basically, where Steve Erceg was able to get get the rear hook to the body and then the lead hook, and hits perfectly on Matt's nose, chin, knocking him the fuck out. And we also saw the development of a probing jab, of being able to just pop the jab, not really trying to hurt, but almost like a feint. And if you're going to have such a dynamic jab that Steve Erceg does, where he's just popping it in your face, once you start probing it, once you start keeping it high, keeping it there, and feinting with it, Steve Erceg's game goes miles, and I'm talking miles ahead of his time, where his striking can look even better than what I've already talked about. So what do I think Steve Erceg has? I think Steve Erceg has beautiful boxing, a beautiful scramble ability, and he's a very composed fighter. He is not trying to just brawl it out when he finds you hurt. He will try to pick his shots and then finish you. He is very composed. He's very calm when he is in that octagon, which I think kind of tails up to his style of being such a flow heavy state when he is wrestling and being such a flow heavy state when he is boxing. Now, what does Steve Erceg not have? I think he is a little bit too wild when it comes to getting into that inside boxing, which kind of leads up to discipline. I don't think he is as disciplined as he should be in terms of his actual striking. He gets a little bit too relaxed, almost way too composed, once again back to his pro, and kind of bites himself in the ass where he gets into this inside brawl and he ends up just eating something. My other con, I guess you would say, is that his chin is very hittable. His chin is very hurtable. He has gotten hurt in his 3 fights in the UFC. He has gotten hit, he's gotten hurt, and so it is a very telling question of how is he going to react to Alexander Pantoja. Alexander Pantoja is a guy who's going to inside box, who's going to brawl, who's going to do everything that Steve Erceg lacks. And then when Steve Erceg is on his ground, he gives up his back. That is another con that I have with Steve Erceg, where he will give his back up, and against Pantoja, that's just not a good look. It's not going to look great. So when we are talking about Steve Erceg against Pantoja, a lot of things need to go right. What do I mean? I think he needs to keep Pantoja honest. I think he needs to keep Pantoja at his boxing range, make it look clean. And if he doesn't, if he accepts the brawl, if he accepts this inside fighting, if he accepts the clinch work, the ground, all sorts of things, this is going to be another Pantoja's title defense. But do not sleep on Steve Erceg, or he will sleep you, because Steve Erceg's boxing is a very, very big problem in this fight. Guys, let me know how you guys feel about Steve Erceg. Let me know if you even knew of Steve Erceg before this fight. I knew of him due to the UFC Fight Pass and watching his regional fights. You can watch that on the UFC Fight Pass. Let me know what other videos you guys are looking for. I am down to do anything you guys request. It's been Stanty. It's been Studs.